Every thought you're having right now, this very moment of awareness, the fact that you can lie here and wonder about your own existence, all of it shaped by a continent most people think of as a birthplace. They're wrong. Africa didn't just birth humanity. It built the human mind. Right now, as you're listening to this, there are over 8 billion humans scattered across every continent on Earth, speaking over 7,000 different languages, living in staggeringly different cultures, building different cities, eating different foods, dreaming different dreams. And yet every single one of us, without exception, can trace our ancestry back to one continent. Africa. Only Africa. Not Europe. Not Asia. Not multiple places simultaneously. Just one continent on one planet over 7 million years. Now, you might think, surely, with all the technology we have today, DNA sequencing, satellite imaging, AI that can reconstruct ancient climates, surely we've figured out why. Surely someone has a clean, simple answer. Here's the thing. For decades, scientists had pieces of the puzzle. Fossils that told part of the story, genetics that told another part, climate data that hinted at something extraordinary, but the pieces never quite fit together. Every theory explained some of the evidence, but left gaping holes in the rest. Until recently, in 2023, a series of discoveries began falling into place. One after another, like dominoes that had been waiting millions of years to topple. And when they did, they revealed something nobody expected. The answer wasn't just about where humans evolved, it was about what Africa did to the human brain. Over 7 million years of relentless, patient, extraordinary training. Tonight, we're going to follow that trail. Every fossil, every gene, every ancient climate shift. All of it leading to one question that changes everything you think you know about being human. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. Maybe subscribe, and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I always check the comments. Someone in Melbourne at morning coffee. Someone in Mexico City at midnight. Someone in Manchester at 3 a.m. Lying in the dark, wondering about the universe. All listening to the same story at the same time. Kind of beautiful, actually. So let's start with a paradox one that kept scientists arguing for over a century. Here's the paradox that haunted scientists for over a century. Primates, our broader biological family, lived across Africa, Europe and Asia, monkeys in South America, lemurs in Madagascar, orangutans in Borneo, apes scattered across 3 continents. But the human lineage, the specific branch that led to you and me and every person who has ever lived, only Africa. For 7 million years, every single ancestor in your direct family tree lived on one continent. Not because they couldn't leave. Primates had been spreading across the globe for tens of millions of years. Something about Africa itself was doing something to our ancestors that no other continent could do. Here's what makes this so frustrating. For decades, scientists proposed theory after theory, and each one explained part of the evidence while leaving the rest in tatters. Was it the climate? Partly. But other continents had dramatic climate shifts too. Was it the geography? Maybe. But geography alone doesn't explain why humans became so radically different from every other primate. Was it just random chance? The mathematical odds against that are staggering. Every explanation felt incomplete, like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. But here's what nobody expected. Scientists weren't just finding new evidence. They were finding the final piece, the one that makes all the other pieces snap into place. And when it did, the picture that emerged was extraordinary. Africa didn't just happen to produce humans. Africa ran the most demanding training program in the history of life on Earth, and your brain is the result. Tonight, we're going to trace that program from the very beginning. We'll start with the fossils, the physical evidence that proves, beyond any doubt, that Africa is the sole cradle of humanity. We'll follow the genetic trail that connects every human alive to a single African origin. We'll walk through the archaeological sites that pushed the human story back 7 million years. And then we'll go deeper into Africa's climate, its geography, its predators, its unique ecological pressures, to understand not just where humans evolved, but why Africa was the only place that could have built the human mind. And we'll end with the breakthroughs, the discoveries from 2023 and 2024 that finally completed the puzzle, the final piece. So settle in, get comfortable. We're about to go back, way back, to a continent that was preparing to forge the most extraordinary mind the natural world has ever produced. And here's what makes this story perfect for drifting off to sleep. It's not rushed. Evolution never is. 7 million years of patient, relentless shaping. There's no urgency here. Just a long, slow, extraordinary journey. Let it carry you. Our story begins with bones, and with a young man in South Africa who made a discovery that nobody believed. Picture this. South Africa, 1924. A young anatomist named Raymond Dart is sitting at his desk in Johannesburg. He's 32 years old, Australian-born, considered an outsider by the European scientific establishment, and someone has just handed him a small box of fossils from a limestone quarry. The room smells of chalk dust and old paper. Afternoon sunlight slants through the window, warm and golden. Dart reaches into the box and pulls out a small skull, tiny, ancient, encased in limestone matrix. He turns it slowly, brushing away the white powder with his fingertips. The stone is still warm, and as he looks at the face, this small, ancient face, he realizes something. He's holding something that could change everything we think we know about where humans came from. Here's the thing. In 1924, nobody believed humans came from Africa. The scientific establishment was certain that humanity's cradle was Europe or Asia. Piltdown man, later exposed as a fraud, had convinced most researchers that big-brained ancestors evolved in England. The idea that Africa, of all places, could be the birthplace of humanity was considered almost offensive. But Dart looked at this skull, a child, about 3 years old, now known as the Taung Child, and he saw something unmistakable, a brain case that was human-like, a face that was moving away from apes and toward us, an upright posture. He published his findings, and the scientific world laughed at him. Not for a year, not for a decade. For nearly 30 years, Raymond Dart was dismissed, ridiculed, ignored. He held the single most important fossil in the history of paleoanthropology, and nobody wanted to believe him. But Africa has a way of revealing the truth, slowly, patiently, one bone at a time. By the 1950s and 60s, a married couple named Lewis and Mary Leakey had set up camp in a place called Olduvai Gorge, in what is now Tanzania, and what they found there was staggering. Layer after layer of human ancestors, stretching back nearly 2 million years. Stone tools, skulls, footprints preserved in volcanic ash, an entire graveyard of human evolution buried in the African earth. And it was all in Africa. Every single significant find. Not one exception. Here's the thing that kept the discoveries rolling. The Great Rift Valley. A massive geological scar running down the eastern side of Africa. It turned out to be one of the greatest fossil preservation sites on Earth. The combination of volcanic activity, lake sediments, and tectonic forces created perfect conditions for turning bones into stone. Africa wasn't just producing human ancestors. It was carefully filing them away for future generations to find. Now, fast forward to 1974 Hadar, Ethiopia. The air is bone dry, the heat shimmering off the desert floor. A young American paleoanthropologist named Donald Johanson is walking through a gully when something catches his eye. A fragment of bone barely visible in the dust. Then another, and another. Over the next few weeks, Johanson and his team pieced together the most complete early human skeleton ever found. 40% of a small female who walked upright 3.2 million years ago. That night back at camp, someone puts on a Beatles cassette. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds plays on repeat while the team celebrates around a campfire. Passing around warm bottles of beer in the Ethiopian night, they name her Lucy. And Lucy changed everything. She proved that bipedalism, walking on 2 legs, came millions of years before big brains. Our ancestors stood up first, thought later, and they did it in Africa. Here's what nobody tells you about the fossil record. Since Lucy, the evidence has only gotten stronger and older. In 2001, A skull called Sahelanthropus chichadensis pushed the human family tree back to nearly 7 million years ago. 7 million years of ancestors. Every single one of them found in Africa. Not in Europe, not in Asia, not scattered across multiple continents as you might expect from a species that eventually conquered the entire planet. Just Africa. Every major fossil discovery that pushed back the human family tree. Every single one. Over more than a century of searching, all found on one continent. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. And patterns like that demand an explanation. But fossils can only tell you so much. They show you where humans lived and when they lived there. For the question of why only Africa? And nowhere else you need something far more powerful. You need DNA. In the 1980s, a group of geneticists did something that would have been impossible just a decade earlier. They extracted mitochondrial DNA, the tiny snippet of genetic code that passes only from mother to child, unchanged, generation after generation, from people all over the world, and they traced it backward. Every line converged on a single point, Africa. Roughly 150,000 to 200,000 years ago, one woman, not the only woman alive at the time, but the one whose mitochondrial lineage survived unbroken to the present day. Scientists called her Mitochondrial Eve. Now, here's the thing. That name caused all sorts of confusion. She wasn't the first human. She wasn't the only woman. She was simply the most recent common maternal ancestor of every living person, and she lived in Africa. A few years later, the same analysis was done with Y chromosomal DNA, the genetic code that passes only from father to son. Same result. Every male lineage on Earth converges back to Africa, between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. Two completely independent genetic systems, both pointing to the same continent and the same time window. But the most devastating piece of evidence, the one that really stops you in your tracks, it comes from a concept called genetic diversity. Here's the thing about genetic diversity. It accumulates over time. The longer a population has existed in a place, the more genetic variation it develops. It's like the rings of a tree. The older the tree, the more rings. So if you were to sample DNA from people across all of Europe, every country, every ethnic group, every remote village, and then sample DNA from people across all of Asia, all of Australia, all of the Americas, and then compare that combined genetic variation to what you'd find in a single village in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian village wins. Let that settle for a moment. You could sample the DNA of billions of people across every continent outside Africa, and you'd find less genetic variation than exists in one small community in East Africa. That's not a metaphor. That's not an exaggeration. That's the actual data. What it means is staggering. Every non-African population on Earth descended from a tiny founding group, probably just a few hundred individuals. They left Africa roughly 100,000 years ago. They carried with them only a small fraction of Africa's total genetic wealth, maybe 5 to 10%. The rest stayed behind. 7 million years of accumulated genetic diversity still living in Africa, still there today. Here's the thing that shifts your entire perspective. When you look at the genetic evidence, every human outside of Africa is essentially a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy. Africa is the original manuscript. So the fossils say Africa. The DNA says Africa. Two completely independent lines of evidence separated by decades of research and entirely different methodologies, pointing to exactly the same answer. But knowing where doesn't answer why. Why only Africa? What was it about this one continent, the only place in 4 billion years of life on Earth to produce a species capable of asking that question? To answer that, we need to go back to the beginning, and we need to follow the trail that those few hundred people left behind when they walked out of Africa and into the unknown. But before we ask why, let's follow those footsteps out of Africa and into the archaeological record that maps our journey across the planet. Now imagine, standing at the edge of Africa, roughly 100,000 years ago, behind you, everything your species has ever known. 7 million years of evolution, every tool your ancestors ever made, every fire they ever lit, every song they ever sang, The warm earth beneath your feet is the same earth that cradled your great-great-great-grandparents going back further than any number can make real. Ahead of you, the unknown. The wind carries the salt smell of a narrow strait, what we now call the Bab el-Mandeb, the Gate of Tears, at the southern tip of the Red Sea. The water stretches maybe 12 miles across. On a clear day, you can see the other side. You're part of a small band, maybe a few hundred people. You carry stone tools, fire-making knowledge, language, and roughly 5 to 10% of Africa's total genetic wealth. You have no idea that your descendants will eventually populate the entire planet, that every person in Tokyo and Toronto and Timbuktu will carry a fragment of what you carry right now. You just know that the world on the other side looks promising, and that the world behind you has been getting harder. So you cross. Every single person listening to this right now, Melbourne, Mexico City, Manchester, wherever you are tonight, carries that African genetic heritage. You are the distant echo of that small band of travellers who stood at the edge of everything they'd ever known and decided to step into the unknown. But here's what makes this story even more extraordinary. Those few hundred people were the exception. The vast majority of humanity stayed in Africa, and the evidence they left behind tells a story that stretches back not thousands, but millions of years. Now let's step back. Way back. 7 million years. Here's the thing about that number 7 million years. It's so large it becomes meaningless, so let's make it real. If you compressed all of human evolutionary history into a single 2-4 hour day, the entire history of civilization, every pyramid, every empire, every war, every symphony, every moon landing, all of it would fit into the last 4 seconds before midnight. Everything before that, the other 23 hours, 59 minutes, and 56 seconds happened in Africa. The trail begins in Chad, in the heart of the Sahara. A skull called Sahelanthropus chadensis, nearly 7 million years old, the oldest known member of our family tree, found in Africa. Move forward to about 4 million years ago. Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, a whole family of upright walking ancestors, the Australopithecines, spreading across eastern and southern Africa, adapting, diversifying, experimenting with different body plans, but never leaving. Then, 2.8 million years ago, something shifts. The genus Homo appears our own branch of the family tree. Bigger brains, better tools, more complex social behavior, and still only in Africa. By 2.4 million years ago, the first stone tools appear at a site called Lamekwi in Kenya, crude but deliberate, requiring the kind of abstract thinking that no other animal had ever demonstrated. Someone had to imagine a sharp edge before it existed, then create it. That's not instinct, that's invention. By 1.9 million years ago, Homo erectus emerges taller, faster, smarter. The first human ancestor to use fire, the first to hunt cooperatively, the first to venture beyond Africa, spreading into Asia and eventually Europe. But here's what nobody tells you about those early migrations. The populations that left Africa between 1.9 million and 500,000 years ago eventually went extinct. The Neanderthals in Europe, Homo erectus in Asia, Denisovans in Siberia, Homo floresiensis on the island of Flores. All gone. The only lineage that survived the one that led to every person alive today stayed in Africa, kept evolving, kept being shaped by Africa's extraordinary pressures for another million years until, roughly 300,000 years ago, the first anatomically modern humans appeared. Us, forged in Africa, refined in Africa. And when we finally did leave for good, this time, around 100,000 years ago, we carried something none of those earlier migrants had possessed. A brain that Africa had spent 7 million years building, not in one dramatic leap, not through one catastrophic event, through millions of years of relentless, patient, extraordinary pressure. Here's the thing that haunts scientists. It's not that humans evolved in Africa. Lots of things evolved in Africa. It's that only humans evolved this level of cognitive complexity, and they did it only in Africa, nowhere else, despite millions of years of opportunity on other continents. So the question shifts, from where to why? What was it about Africa specifically, uniquely, irreplaceably, that built the human mind, The answer starts with something you might not expect: the weather. So now we know where. We know that every fossil, every strand of DNA, every archaeological site points to one continent and one continent only. But knowing where isn't enough. Knowing where just deepens the mystery. Why? What was it about Africa, specifically Africa, that turned a population of tree-dwelling primates into the most cognitively complex species the planet has ever produced? The answer lies in a unique combination of factors that existed nowhere else on Earth, and it all starts with Africa's climate. Here's the thing about Africa's climate. It wasn't just hot, it wasn't just dry, it wasn't just challenging, it was unstable, relentlessly, unpredictably, maddeningly unstable. Over the past 2 million years, East Africa experienced climate oscillations unlike anything seen on any other continent. Forests would expand, covering the landscape in dense canopy, and then, sometimes within a few thousand years, sometimes within a single human lifetime, those forests would vanish, replaced by open savanna. Then the savanna would dry further, becoming near desert. Then the rains would return, and the cycle would begin again. Forest, grassland, desert, grassland, forest, over and over and over for 2 million years. Now, most animals respond to environmental change in one of two ways. They specialize adapting perfectly to one specific environment, or they migrate following their preferred conditions as they shift across the landscape. But here's what made East Africa's climate so extraordinary. The changes were too rapid for specialization and too widespread for migration. There was nowhere to go. The entire region was shifting, oscillating, transforming, and any species living there had only one option: adapt, not to a specific environment, but to change itself. This is what scientists call the Variability Selection Hypothesis. And when you understand it, it changes everything about how you think about human evolution. The idea is elegantly simple. It wasn't the heat that made us human. It wasn't the cold. It wasn't the drought or the flood or any single environmental pressure. It was the fact that the environment kept changing faster and faster, more and more unpredictably, and the only way to survive was to develop a brain flexible enough to handle whatever came next. Think of it this way. Africa's climate was like a personal trainer who knows exactly how hard to push you. Enough challenge to force adaptation, enough recovery time to consolidate gains, and just when you think you've mastered one environment, everything changes again. Here's the thing that makes this even more remarkable. We have physical proof that our ancestors were rising to the challenge. Stone tool caches from 2 million years ago, carefully shaped, deliberately stored, prove that early humans weren't just reacting to their environment. They were planning for the future. They were thinking ahead. They were doing something that no other primate on the continent was doing, anticipating change before it arrived. And during the dry seasons, when water became scarce, something else happened. Populations that had been spread across the landscape converged around the remaining water sources, lakes, rivers, springs. Dozens of family groups, maybe hundreds of individuals, suddenly sharing the same shrinking territory. The social pressure must have been extraordinary. You couldn't just fight everyone. You couldn't just flee. You had to communicate, negotiate, form alliances, read intentions, predict behavior. Imagine standing on the East African savanna 1.5 million years ago. Yesterday, there were trees here. You remember the shade, the fruit hanging just within reach, the familiar sounds of the canopy. Today, nothing. The trees are gone. The air smells different, dusty, open, exposed. The horizon stretches in every direction, flat and golden and merciless. And somewhere in your mind, in that extraordinary, rapidly evolving brain, a thought forms, not panic, not flight, something quieter, something more powerful, a plan. Here's what nobody tells you about the Variability Selection Hypothesis. It doesn't just explain why humans became smart. It explains why humans became specifically the kind of smart we are. Flexible, creative, capable of imagining things that don't exist yet, and then making them real. Your ancestors weren't adapting to any single environment. They were adapting to change itself. And that distinction between adapting to a place and adapting to uncertainty is the difference between every other species on Earth and us. Africa wasn't just producing human ancestors, it was training times them, relentlessly, patiently, one climate shift at a time. But Africa's climate wasn't just unstable, it existed within a very specific temperature range, a Goldilocks zone that made cognitive evolution possible. Here's the thing about the Goldilocks zone. You've probably heard the term applied to planets that narrow band of distance from a star where water can exist as liquid, where conditions are just right for life. Not too hot, not too cold. Africa had its own Goldilocks zone, but this one wasn't about distance from a star. It was about temperature range. East Africa, throughout the Pleistocene, maintained average temperatures between roughly 15 and 30 degrees Celsius. And that range, that specific narrow band, turns out to be extraordinarily important for cognitive evolution. Why? Because it was challenging enough to push our ancestors to their limits without being so extreme that survival consumed all their energy. In temperatures below 10 degrees, the body burns enormous calories just staying warm. Above 35, heat stress shuts down higher cognitive function. But in that sweet spot, that Goldilocks zone, the body has enough energy left over for the most expensive organ it carries, the brain. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. Let's compare Africa to every other continent and see why none of them could have built the human mind. Europe. Europe had dramatic climate change. The ice ages came and went in massive, grinding cycles. But here's the critical difference. Europe's climate changes were predictable. The ice advanced slowly, retreated slowly, and followed patterns that stretched over tens of thousands of years. Species had time to specialize. Neanderthals adapted beautifully to the cold, stocky bodies, large nasal passages for warming frigid air, incredible physical strength. They were specialists, magnificently adapted to one type of environment. But specialization is a trap. When your environment changes faster than your specialization can keep up, you're in trouble. And that's exactly what happened. The tropics, Southeast Asia, Central America, equatorial regions outside Africa, these were stable, warm, wet, abundant. Which sounds ideal, except stability doesn't build cognitive flexibility. If your environment provides everything you need, year after year, century after century, there's no pressure to innovate. No reason to develop the kind of restless, creative, problem-solving intelligence that characterizes humans. North America had variability, dramatic swings between ice age and interglacial warmth. But it was the wrong kind of variability. The shifts were too extreme, too prolonged, and the geography allowed species to simply migrate south when conditions deteriorated. There was always an escape route. Africa had no escape route, and its variability was rapid, unpredictable, and relentless. Here's the thing. Every continent on Earth had its challenges. Glaciers, volcanoes, droughts, floods. But no other continent had this specific combination rapid oscillation within a temperature range that allowed cognitive development with no way out. Now, scientists are still debating the precise mechanisms, that's how science works, and anyone who tells you they have all the answers is selling you something. But here's what the evidence converges on. Recent DNA analysis has revealed something remarkable. The genes responsible for brain development, specifically the genes controlling neuron growth, synaptic plasticity, and cortical folding, show signs of intense positive selection during precisely the periods of maximum climate variability. The same periods, the same windows. It's as if Africa's climate was writing instructions into our DNA, not metaphorically, literally. The environmental pressure was so intense, so sustained, that it changed the very genes that build human brains. Imagine that for a moment. Your ancestors looked at a world that had just been rewritten, forests gone, water scarce, familiar landscapes transformed beyond recognition, and they figured it out. Again, and again, and again, for 2 million years. And each time they figured it out, the ones whose brains were slightly more flexible, slightly more creative, slightly better at anticipating what came next, those were the ones who survived to pass on their genes. The climate was the forge, but as we're about to discover, geography was the anvil. Because Africa wasn't just changing its climate, it was also trapping its inhabitants inside a continent-sized laboratory, And what happened next is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of life on Earth. Look at a map of Africa. Really look at it. To the north, the Sahara Desert, the largest hot desert on Earth. Over 3.5 million square miles of sand, rock, and heat so extreme that almost nothing survives. To the east, the Indian Ocean. To the west, the Atlantic. To the south, more ocean, stretching unbroken to Antarctica. And to the northeast, the only land connection to the rest of the world, a narrow corridor through what is now Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, barely 9 miles wide at its narrowest point. 9 miles. That's the distance between Africa and the rest of the planet. And for millions of years, that 9 miles might as well have been 9,000. Here's the thing. Africa is effectively an island. A continent-sized island surrounded by desert and ocean, with one tiny, easily blocked exit. And that simple geographic fact, that containment, turns out to be one of the most important factors in human evolution, because containment creates pressure, and pressure, as we've already seen, creates adaptation. Scientists call it the selection trap. When a population can't migrate away from environmental challenges, it has exactly two options: adapt or perish. There is no door number 3, no escape hatch. No. Let's just move south until things calm down. Our ancestors were trapped inside Africa's forge, and Africa never let up. But here's where the geography becomes truly extraordinary. Because Africa didn't just contain its inhabitants, it cycled them. The Sahara Desert, that massive barrier to the north, wasn't always there. Over the past several million years, the Sahara has appeared and disappeared dozens of times. When the climate was wet, the Sahara became green savanna, lush grasslands with rivers and lakes teeming with life. Populations from sub-Saharan Africa could spread northward, mixing with populations from North Africa and even reaching the Mediterranean coast. Then the climate would shift again, the rains would stop, the grass would die, the rivers would vanish, and the Sahara would return a wall of sand cutting the continent in two. Imagine the desert appearing and disappearing, not over millennia, within lifetimes. Your grandparents walked through green grassland where you now see nothing but sand stretching to the horizon. The wind carries no moisture. The air is hot and still and empty. Scientists call this the Sahara Pump, and it worked like this. When the Sahara was green, populations connected. Genes flowed. Ideas spread. Cultural innovations, new tools, new techniques, new ways of processing food traveled across the continent like ripples in a pond. Then the desert would return, and those connected populations would be cut off from each other, isolated. Each group now evolving independently, adapting to its own local conditions, developing its own subtle variations. And then the pump would cycle again. The desert would retreat, populations would reconnect, and all those independently evolved traits would mix together in a burst of genetic and cultural exchange. Connection, isolation. Connection, isolation. Over and over for millions of years. Here's the thing, and this is crucial. This cycle of mixing and isolation is one of the most powerful engines of evolutionary innovation known to science. Pure isolation leads to specialization and eventual dead ends. Pure connection leads to homogeneity and stagnation. But the alternation between the two, that's where the magic happens. Each period of isolation lets populations develop unique adaptations. Each period of connection lets those adaptations combine. The result is a species that carries the accumulated innovations of dozens of semi-independent populations, all woven together into one extraordinarily diverse genetic tapestry. And the Mediterranean, that narrow 9-mile barrier to the northeast, played its own role. For millions of years, it was just narrow enough to let a trickle of adventurous primates through, but too wide and too dangerous for any large-scale migration. It was a one-way valve, slowly releasing pressure, but never enough to relieve the selection trap. Here's the brilliant part. The semi-permeable barriers within Africa, the Sahara, the Rift Valley walls, the Congo rainforest, the great rivers created a mosaic of slightly different populations, not different species, the same species, Homo, in dozens of variations, each group with its own subtle edge, its own local genius, its own answer to the question of how to survive, and the barrier that contained them, the desert, the ocean, the narrow strait was the same barrier that refined them. Because every time conditions changed, every time the pumps cycled, every time populations mixed and separated and mixed again, the human mind got a little sharper, a little more flexible, a little more extraordinary. Africa wasn't just containing its inhabitants. It was times refining them times into a species capable of eventually overcoming every barrier on Earth. But Africa's geography had another gift, one hidden in the Great Rift Valley and the chain of lakes along its floor. The Great Rift Valley is one of the most dramatic geological features on Earth, a massive scar running nearly 4,000 miles down the eastern side of Africa, from Ethiopia in the north to Mozambique in the south. In places, the valley walls rise over a mile above the valley floor, sheer cliffs of ancient rock, carved by millions of years of tectonic forces slowly pulling the continent apart. And it turns out that this geological scar was one of the most important factors in human evolution. Here's why. The Rift Valley didn't just split the landscape, it created an extraordinary mosaic of distinct ecological zones, separated by steep walls that were difficult but not impossible to cross. On one side of a ridge, dense forest. On the other, open savanna. A few miles further, volcanic highlands, then a lake basin, then semi-arid scrubland. Scientists call these parapatric zones, areas where different environments exist side by side, separated by partial barriers. And parapatric zones are evolutionary gold. Because populations living in adjacent but different environments evolve slightly differently, developing their own local adaptations while still occasionally mixing, when individuals cross the barriers between them, the result is something called hybrid vigor. When locally adapted populations mix, their offspring often combine the best traits of both groups. It's the opposite of inbreeding. It's outbreeding on a continental scale, powered by geography. But the Rift Valley had another gift for our ancestors, one that scientists didn't fully appreciate until recently. The lakes. Tucked into the floor of the Rift Valley, a chain of permanent lakes, Turkana, Victoria, Malawi, Tanganyika, served as anchor points of stability in an otherwise chaotic world. When the droughts came, when the savanna turned to dust and the rivers ran dry, these lakes persisted. They were refuges, places where populations could survive the worst of the climate oscillations. But they were more than refuges. They were evolutionary mixing bowls. During droughts, populations from across the region converged on these lakes. Groups that had been evolving independently for generations, each with their own tools, their own techniques, their own subtle cognitive adaptations, suddenly found themselves sharing the same shoreline. Ideas mixed. Genes mixed. Innovations that had developed in isolation were tested, combined, refined. Picture this. A Rift Valley lake, 500,000 years ago. The late afternoon sun turns the water copper gold. The air is warm and still, carrying the faint smell of mud and green things growing. A small group of early humans sits along the water's edge, cracking open freshwater mussels against flat stones. Children wade in the shallows, splashing quietly. It looks peaceful. It is peaceful. But something extraordinary is happening here. Something that would change the course of evolution. Here's what nobody tells you about these lakes. They weren't just refuges. They were nutritional engines. The fish, the shellfish, the aquatic plants growing along the margins, all of them rich in something that the human brain desperately needed: omega-3 fatty acids, specifically DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, one of the primary building blocks of neural tissue. The human brain is roughly 60% fat by dry weight, and a significant proportion of that fat is DHA. Without adequate omega-3 intake, brain development stalls. With it, the brain can grow rapidly, dramatically, in ways that no other organ in the body can match. And here's the thing. These Rift Valley lakes provided exactly the nutritional fuel that Africa's climate was demanding. The environmental pressure was selecting for bigger, more flexible brains, and the lakes were providing the raw materials to build them. It's like upgrading the hardware while the software was still being written. Africa's climate and geography weren't working separately, they were working together, in a feedback loop that accelerated cognitive evolution far beyond anything happening on any other continent. Archaeological evidence from sites like Pinnacle Point in South Africa, dating back 164,000 years, shows early humans systematically harvesting shellfish and processing marine resources. This wasn't opportunistic. It was deliberate. Our ancestors had figured out that the water's edge was where the best brain food lived. The Rift Valley, a geological accident that carved Africa into the most extraordinary natural laboratory imaginable. Different environments side by side, each producing slightly different human populations. Permanent lakes that served as refuges, mixing bowls and nutritional engines. And a feedback loop between environmental pressure and nutritional availability that turbocharged the evolution of the human brain. No other continent on Earth had anything like it. The climate was the forge, the geography was the anvil. But Africa had one more element in its training program, and it came with teeth. Now, imagine you're one of those early humans. Dawn, roughly 2 million years ago. You step out of a rough shelter at the edge of a Rift Valley lake. The air is cool against your skin, that brief window between the chill of night and the heat of day. Somewhere nearby, a bird calls, then another. The sky is turning pale gold along the eastern horizon, and the grass, tall, golden, swaying, gently stretches in every direction. It looks beautiful. It is beautiful. But your eyes aren't admiring the view. They're scanning, constantly scanning. Because you know with an awareness so deep it's almost instinct that something in that grass is watching you. Africa's predator diversity is unmatched anywhere on Earth. Lions, leopards, cheetahs, wild dogs, spotted hyenas, crocodiles, pythons, eagles, every one of them better armed than you, every one of them faster, stronger, equipped with claws and teeth and venom that evolution spent millions of years sharpening. And here's the thing. It wasn't just the number of predators that mattered. It was the diversity. A lion hunts differently from a leopard. A leopard hunts differently from a hyena. A crocodile attacks from the water. An eagle strikes from the sky. A python ambushes from stillness. Each predator represents a completely different kind of threat, a different speed, a different strategy, a different time of day, a different terrain. You couldn't develop one defense strategy and relax. There was no single solution. Every time you figured out how to avoid one predator, another was evolving a new way to catch you. It was an arms race, but not a simple one. It was a multi-front, multi-dimensional cognitive arms race that demanded constant innovation. And that arms race built something extraordinary in the human brain. Theory of mind. Theory of mind is the ability to model what another being is thinking. Not just what it's doing, what it's thinking. To look at a lion crouching in the grass and understand not just that it's dangerous, but that it's waiting, that it's chosen this spot because the wind is carrying your scent away from it, that it's patient, that it's planning. To survive Africa's predators, our ancestors had to think like predators. They had to build mental models of other minds, predict behavior, anticipate strategies, understand intentions. And that cognitive ability, theory of mind, is the same ability that later allowed humans to cooperate in groups, negotiate complex social hierarchies, teach children through language, and eventually build civilizations. Africa's predators didn't just threaten our ancestors, they taught them to think. Here's what makes this even more remarkable. Our ancestors didn't just learn to avoid predators, they learned from them. Scavenging, arriving at a kill site after the predator had finished, became one of the most important food sources for early humans. But scavenging isn't simple. You have to read the landscape like a detective. What killed this animal? How long ago? Is the predator still nearby? What direction did it go? Are there other scavengers, hyenas, vultures that might compete with you or signal danger? Our ancestors became what scientists now call forensic ecologists, reading the African landscape for clues, interpreting evidence, drawing conclusions, making decisions under uncertainty. Every kill site was a classroom. Every set of tracks was a puzzle. Every decision, approach or retreat, share or hoard, fight or flee was a test of cognitive flexibility. Here's the thing. No other continent on Earth had this combination. Predator diversity this extreme, sustained over millions of years, with no escape route for the prey. Europe had wolves and bears, dangerous certainly, but predictable. Asia had tigers lethal but solitary, with a limited range of hunting strategies. South America had jaguars and caimans, but nothing approaching Africa's relentless, varied, omnipresent predator pressure. Africa's predators were the final element in the training program. The climate forced our ancestors to think flexibly. The geography trapped them and mixed them. The nutrition from the Rift Valley lakes fueled their growing brains. And the predators, those magnificent, terrifying, endlessly inventive predators, forced those brains to develop the most sophisticated cognitive ability in the natural world, the ability to understand other minds. And as those brains grew, as theory of mind deepened, as our ancestors became better and better at reading intentions and predicting behavior, the predators adapted too. They got smarter, more cunning, more patient, which pushed our ancestors to get smarter still. An arms race with no finish line, running for millions of years, on a continent that was simultaneously changing its climate, cycling its populations, and feeding its inhabitants the exact nutrients they needed to build bigger brains. No wonder we turned out the way we did. But here's where the predator story takes a turn that nobody expects. Africa didn't just have dangerous predators. It had the only predators on Earth that had been studying humans for millions of years. Think about what happened when humans eventually reached other continents. In Australia, the Megafauna giant wombats the size of cars, marsupial lions, enormous flightless birds, had never encountered anything like a human hunter. They had no instinctive fear, no evolved defenses against cooperative tool-wielding primates. Within a few thousand years of human arrival, most of them were gone. The same pattern repeated in the Americas. Mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, species that had thrived for millions of years vanished within centuries of human contact. But in Africa? Africa's megafauna survived. Elephants still roam, hippos still dominate rivers, lions still hunt. And the reason is extraordinary. Africa's large animals had co-evolved alongside humans for millions of years. They had learned. They had adapted. They had developed their own counter-strategies against the most dangerous predator the planet had ever produced. Here's the thing. This co-evolution created an escalating cognitive arms race that existed nowhere else on Earth. Every time our ancestors developed a new hunting strategy, Africa's prey adapted. Every time the prey adapted, our ancestors had to innovate again. It was like an endless chess match, played out over geological time, and both sides kept getting smarter. Consider what it took to bring down a 1-4-foot elephant with stone tools and wooden spears. You couldn't do it alone. You couldn't do it with brute strength. You needed planning days of observation, tracking migration patterns, identifying vulnerable individuals. You needed coordination, a dozen hunters working in synchronized formation, each knowing their role, each anticipating the movements of the others. You needed communication, not just grunts and gestures, but something approaching language. And you needed courage. The kind of courage that comes from trusting that the person beside you will do exactly what they promised. Cooperative hunting didn't just feed our ancestors. It built the social architecture of the human mind: trust, planning, role specialization, shared risk, shared reward. But predators and prey weren't Africa's only training tools. There was something else, something invisible, something our ancestors couldn't see or hear or smell: disease. Africa has more human pathogens than any other continent on Earth. Malaria alone has been shaping human genetics for hundreds of thousands of years. It drove the evolution of sickle cell traits, blood type variations, and immune system adaptations. These changes still affect billions of people today. Here's what makes this significant for the story of the human mind. Disease pressure didn't just strengthen our bodies. It drove the evolution of social behaviors, avoiding contaminated water, isolating the sick, developing early forms of medicine using plants and minerals. These aren't instinctive behaviors. They require observation, reasoning, communication, and the ability to connect cause and effect across time. Every challenge Africa threw at our ancestors, every predator, every drought, every disease, every climate shift, demanded the same thing: not bigger muscles, not sharper claws, not thicker skin, a better brain. Here's the thing that puts all of this into perspective. When humans finally left Africa roughly 100,000 years ago, every other environment on Earth must have seemed almost manageable by comparison. The predators were naive, the climates were stable, the diseases were fewer. Our ancestors had been forged in the most demanding school on Earth, and graduation day was about to change the planet forever. But Africa wasn't finished, because all of these pressures, The climate, the geography, the predators, the diseases, they weren't just making humans tougher. They were creating something unprecedented in the history of life on this planet. They were building the human mind, and the evidence for how they did it is written in stone, literally. Here's the thing about building a mind. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in stages, each one unlocking the next, like a series of doors where the key to each door is forged by walking through the one before it. And the first door? It opened when the forests began to disappear. Around 6 to 7 million years ago, Africa's climate shifted. Dense forests gave way to open woodland and savanna. Our ancestors faced a choice that would define everything that followed. The trees, their homes, their safety, their food source were vanishing. And in the gaps between the remaining patches of forest, a new world was opening up. Flat, exposed, dangerous. Some primates retreated deeper into what forest remained. They became chimps, bonobos, gorillas, specialists of the shrinking canopy. But one lineage did something different. They stood up. Bipedalism, walking upright on two legs, is one of the most consequential innovations in the history of life on Earth. And it happened in Africa, driven by Africa's specific environmental pressures. Here's what standing up actually meant. It freed the hands, and free hands changed everything. The oldest stone tools ever found date to 3.3 million years ago from a site called Lemekwi in Kenya. And here's the thing nobody tells you about those tools. Making them wasn't simple. It required selecting the right type of stone, visualizing the finished tool inside the raw material, and striking at precisely the correct angle with precisely the correct force. That's abstract thinking. That's mental modeling. That's a brain doing something no other brain on Earth could do, imagining something that doesn't exist yet, and then making it real. By 2.5 million years ago, a standardized tool tradition had emerged, the older one industry. Standardized, meaning our ancestors weren't just making tools randomly, they were following templates, teaching each other, passing knowledge from one generation to the next. That's culture. That's cultural evolution running alongside biological evolution, and it was happening only in Africa. Now, here's where the numbers become staggering. Your brain is roughly 2% of your body weight, but it consumes 20% of your total calories. It's the most expensive organ you carry, and in evolutionary terms, expensive organs don't grow larger unless there's an overwhelming survival advantage. Over the course of about 2 million years, the human brain roughly doubled in size from around 600 cubic centimeters to nearly 1,350. In evolutionary terms, that's lightning fast. Something was driving that growth with extraordinary force. Here's what scientists call the expensive tissue hypothesis. A bigger brain requires a smaller gut because you can't afford to run both at maximum capacity. A smaller gut means you need higher quality, more calorie-dense food. And the highest quality food available on the African savanna was meat. So our ancestors, with their free hands and their stone tools, began to hunt. And the meat they ate fueled bigger brains, and bigger brains made better hunters, and better hunters got more meat. A feedback loop, accelerating, compounding, running for 2 million years. But here's the thing that connects this back to something we discovered earlier. Remember the Rift Valley lakes? Those permanent bodies of water that served as refuges during droughts? They weren't just refuges. They were nutritional engines. The fish, the shellfish, the aquatic resources in our ancestors' diets were packed with omega-3 fatty acids, specifically DHA, the building block of brain tissue. It's like Africa was upgrading the hardware while the software was still being written. Researchers at Pinnacle Point in South Africa found evidence of systematic shellfish harvesting dating back 164,000 years. Our ancestors weren't just surviving by the water, they were feeding the most energy-hungry organ in their bodies with precisely the fuel it needed to grow. And then, roughly 1 million years ago, something happened that changed everything again. Fire. Imagine this. The African savanna at dusk. The temperature is dropping. The sounds of the day birdsong, insect hum, the rustle of grass are fading into the quiet of evening. And then, in the gathering darkness, a small circle of orange light appears. Warm, steady, safe. A campfire. The warmth on your face, the crackle and pop of burning wood, the smell of smoke and cooked food, the soft glow illuminating the faces of the people around you, your family, your allies, the people who hunted beside you and shared their food with you. Fire did something no other innovation could do. It extended the social day. Before fire, darkness meant sleep or danger. After fire, darkness meant conversation, storytelling, teaching, planning tomorrow's hunt while the children listened and learned. The campfire became the first classroom, the first boardroom, the first theatre, and in that warm circle of light, something was stirring, something that would take another 1,000,000 years to fully emerge, but whose first whispers were already audible in the flickering shadows. Language, and language, true, complex, symbolic language, would prove to be Africa's most extraordinary gift to the human mind. Here's the thing about language. We take it so completely for granted that we forget what an extraordinary thing it is. Right now, as you listen to these words, your brain is performing an operation so complex that no computer on Earth can fully replicate it. You're decoding a rapid stream of sounds into abstract concepts, connecting those concepts to memories and emotions, building mental images of places you've never been and times you've never lived in, and doing all of it effortlessly, automatically, while lying in the dark. That ability was built in Africa, and it was built because Africa demanded it. Consider the environment. Climate changed without warning. Predators attacked from multiple directions. Water sources appeared and vanished. Dozens of family groups had to share shrinking territory. In that world, the ability to share complex information across generations wasn't just useful, it was the difference between survival and extinction. Imagine the first time an elder was able to tell a younger generation not just where to find water now, but where water appeared 3 droughts ago. Not just which plants were safe to eat, but which ones looked safe but would make you sick. Not just that the lions hunt at dawn, but that this particular pride has a pattern of circling from the east when the wind blows from the south. Language didn't just communicate. It compressed millions of years of hard-won survival knowledge into something that could be passed from one mind to another in minutes. Every generation started from where the last one left off, instead of having to learn everything from scratch. Here's what nobody tells you about this process. The brain regions that handle language, Broca's area for speech production, Wernicke's area for comprehension, show signs of rapid evolution. And this happened during precisely the periods when Africa's environmental pressures were most intense. The same climate variability that drove tool innovation was simultaneously driving the evolution of communication. Africa wasn't building one capability at a time, it was building everything at once. But language was only the beginning, because somewhere along the way something even more remarkable happened. Our ancestors began to think in symbols. Picture this. The southern coast of South Africa, roughly 100,000 years ago, a cave called Blombos, carved into the cliffs above a turquoise sea. The air smells of salt and crushed shellfish. Outside the cave mouth, you can hear waves crashing against the rocks below, a rhythmic, endless pulse that has been sounding for millions of years. The stone underfoot is cool and smooth, worn by generations of feet. Inside the cave, in the dim light filtering through the entrance, someone is kneeling on the floor. They've collected pieces of ochre, a red mineral, and they're grinding it into powder on a flat stone. The red dust stains their fingers, their palms, the stone beneath them. The grinding sound is soft and repetitive, almost meditative. And then they take a sharp tool, maybe a stone point, maybe a bone, and they begin to scratch lines into a piece of ochre. Not randomly, deliberately. Crossed lines, a geometric pattern, something that means something. This is not a tool. This is not a weapon. This serves no immediate survival purpose. This is art. This is symbol. This is a mind that has crossed a threshold. No other mind on Earth has ever crossed the threshold, from reacting to the world to interpreting the world, from surviving to meaning. Here's the thing that makes Blombos Cave so profound. Those ochre engravings are evidence of abstract thought, the ability to let one thing stand for another. A crossed line represents an idea. A pattern carries meaning that exists only in the mind of its creator. That's the foundation of everything humans have ever built. Every word you've ever spoken is a symbol. Every number, every law, every religion, every scientific theory, all of it rests on the ability to think symbolically. And that ability first appeared in Africa. And it wasn't just blombos. Across the continent, the evidence accumulates. Shell beads strung into necklaces, personal ornamentation, meaning identity, meaning I am this, not that. Ochre processing sites suggesting ritual behavior. Burial practices hinting at beliefs about what happens after the body stops moving. The leap from survival to meaning, from instinct to imagination, from reaction to reflection. And all of this was driven by Africa's specific conditions. The social complexity created by climate variability and geographic containment drove targeted evolution in specific brain regions. The frontal lobes for planning and social reasoning, the temporal lobes for language, the parietal lobes for tool use and spatial navigation. Africa's conditions created us, shaped our minds, built the cognitive toolkit that would eventually allow our descendants to spread across the entire planet and reshape it according to their will. And here's something to sit with for a moment. The brain processing these words right now, the one that's lying there in the dark, drifting between wakefulness and sleep, following a story about its own origins that brain was built in Africa. Every neuron, every connection, every flash of understanding or moment of wonder you're experiencing right now, all of it was shaped by a continent that spent 7 million years perfecting it. Kind of extraordinary when you think about it, but we're not quite finished. Because there's one more piece of the puzzle, the final piece that the title of this story promised. And it came from a place nobody expected, at a time when most scientists thought the big questions had already been answered. Remember that promise from the very beginning of this story? The final piece of the puzzle? We've spent the last hour and a half following the evidence. Fossils, genetics, archaeology, climate, geography, predators, cognition, all of it pointing to one continent, one extraordinary training ground that produced the only species in 4 billion years of life on Earth capable of asking why. But for decades, scientists had a problem. Each piece of evidence explained part of the picture. Climate variability explained cognitive flexibility. Geographic containment explained genetic diversity. Predator coevolution explained social intelligence. But no single theory tied everything together. No one had found the thread that connected all the threads. Here's the thing about scientific puzzles. They don't usually come together all at once. They come together slowly, grudgingly, one paper at a time. Until one day, someone publishes something that makes everyone else sit up and say, "Oh, that's what we were missing." In January 2023, that paper was published. A team of researchers analysed the genomes of 290,000 individuals from populations around the world. They used them to reconstruct human population history going back 2 million years. Let that scale settle for a moment. 290,000 individual genomes. That's like reading every book in every library in a mid-sized country, except instead of books, you're reading the genetic autobiography of our species. And what they found was staggering. The human lineage experienced multiple severe population bottlenecks periods when the total number of breeding individuals crashed to catastrophically low numbers. And every single one of these bottlenecks occurred exclusively in the African human lineage. The most severe hit roughly 930,000 years ago, and it lasted 117,000 years. Here's the thing about a population bottleneck. Imagine your entire species, every human ancestor alive at the time, squeezed down to a population roughly the size of a small town, maybe 1,280 breeding individuals, for 117,000 years. That's not a bad century. That's not a rough millennium. That's 117,000 years of hanging on by a thread. For context, that's longer than our entire species Homo sapiens has existed. Now, here's where it gets extraordinary. When the researchers compared these bottlenecks to climate records, the correlation was devastating. Every major population crash aligned precisely with massive continental-scale droughts. Mega droughts that transformed East Africa into near-desert conditions for thousands of years at a time. Africa wasn't just challenging our ancestors, it was testing them to the absolute limit of survival. And only the most cognitively flexible, the most socially cooperative, the most innovative individuals made it through. Here's what nobody expected. During these bottleneck periods, these times of maximum pressure and minimum population tool complexity didn't decrease, it increased. The archaeological record shows that our ancestors were innovating faster during the worst conditions. More sophisticated tools, new techniques, evidence of planning and foresight. The mega droughts weren't just catastrophes, they were innovation engines. The worse things got, the more creative our ancestors became, because the only individuals who survived were the ones whose brains could find solutions that nobody had ever found before. But the January 2023 study was just the beginning, because over the next 2 years, discovery after discovery began falling into place like dominoes that had been waiting millions of years to topple. And when they did, the picture that emerged wasn't just remarkable, it was the final piece. And it came from a place that scientists thought they'd already thoroughly explored, a dusty basin in Kenya that had been studied for decades. Except this time, they found something that changed everything. In August 2023, researchers working at the Olojasali Basin in Kenya, a site that had been studied for decades, announced a discovery that sent shockwaves through the field. A cranium dating to roughly 760,000 years ago showed something remarkable. Brain size had increased by 15% in just 300,000 years, an evolutionary sprint by any measure. And alongside the cranium, they found tools that were far more advanced than anything expected for that time period. Hafted tools, stone blades deliberately attached to wooden handles with natural adhesives, technology that wasn't supposed to exist for another 400,000 years. Here's the thing, this wasn't an isolated find, it was part of a cascade. In 2024, researchers announced that ochre, processing the deliberate grinding of mineral pigments, had been found at sites dating to 800,000 years ago. That's 700,000 years earlier than the Blombos cave engravings we talked about. 700,000 years. And alongside the ochre, evidence of systematic shell collection and deliberate landscape fire management. Not accidental fires. Managed fires. Controlled burning of grasslands to drive prey and encourage new growth 800,000 years ago. The implications were staggering. Symbolic behavior, the kind of abstract thinking that separates humans from every other species, didn't emerge suddenly 100,000 years ago, as most scientists had assumed. It had been developing gradually, in Africa, for nearly 1 million years. But perhaps the most powerful piece of evidence came from a question that sounds deceptively simple. If Africa's conditions were so extraordinary at producing cognitive evolution, why only humans? Chimps lived in Africa too, so did gorillas, so did baboons, and dozens of other primate species. They faced the same climate shifts, the same predators, the same geographic containment. So why didn't they develop the same cognitive toolkit? Here's the thing, and this is one of the most fascinating questions in all of evolutionary biology. Same continent, same pressures, radically different outcomes. Chimpanzees responded to environmental instability by becoming conservative. They retreated into whatever forest remained and doubled down on what they already knew. They're brilliant, but their brilliance is specialized. Gorillas responded by getting bigger, physical dominance, specialization in specific food sources. Baboons responded with aggression, hierarchical societies organized around physical power. Only humans, only the lineage that would become us, responded to Africa's relentless pressure by becoming more innovative, more creative, more cooperative, more communicative. Why? Because of a unique combination of traits that evolved together. Bipedalism freed the hands. Hands made tools. Tools unlocked meat. Meat fueled bigger brains. Bigger brains developed language. Language enabled culture. Culture accumulated across generations. No other primate had all of those traits evolving simultaneously. It was the combination that mattered, and that combination could only have emerged under Africa's specific conditions. Now, scientists are still debating the precise mechanisms that's how science works, and that's how it should work. But here's what the evidence converges on. Africa's unique combination, extreme climate variability, geographic containment, ecological pressure, nutritional resources was not a coincidence, not random. It was a permanent, structural feature of the continent's position on Earth. Africa sits on the equator. The planet's climate systems interact most intensely there. The intertropical convergence zone oscillates north and south, driving cycles of drought and rainfall that have reshaped East Africa for millions of years. Tectonic forces carved the Rift Valley, created the lake systems that fed our ancestors' growing brains. The Sahara expands and contracts with clockwork regularity, cycling populations through isolation and connection. It wasn't luck. It was geology. It was geography. It was the planet itself. Imagine designing a continent, one built to force the evolution of a species capable of language. Art, science, philosophy, music, mathematics. A species capable of the quiet wonder of lying in the dark and thinking about where it came from. You couldn't do better than Africa. And that's the final piece. Not a single discovery, but a convergence. Fossils, genetics, climate models, archaeological evidence, brain evolution studies, genomic population analysis, all from completely independent fields, all pointing to exactly the same conclusion. Africa didn't just give birth to humanity. Africa built the human mind, deliberately, relentlessly, over 7 million patient extraordinary years. And every thought you're having right now, this very moment of awareness, this gentle drifting between wakefulness and sleep, is the product of that continent's training. So, what does it mean? What does it mean that every human alive carries a mind that was forged by one continent, shaped by forces that are still at work today? That's worth thinking about, gently, quietly, as the story begins to slow down. So there it is, 7 million years, one continent, and a mind your mind that carries the fingerprints of every climate shift, every predator, every drought, every lake, every campfire, every stone tool, every act of courage and creativity that Africa demanded of your ancestors. Let that settle for a moment. There's no rush. There's no test at the end of this. Just a story, a very long, very old story that happens to be yours. You know, there's something almost calming about deep time. When you zoom out far enough past the news cycle, past the deadlines, past the small anxieties that keep you awake at night, and you see the full sweep of 7 million years, the things that feel urgent right now start to look very, very small. Not unimportant, just small, against a canvas that stretches back to the first upright footstep on an African savanna. The campfire is dying down now, metaphorically speaking. We've been sitting around it for nearly 2 hours, following a trail of evidence from Raymond Dart's dusty office in 1924 to the genomic laboratories of 2023. We've walked through the Rift Valley and stood at the edge of Africa watching our ancestors cross into the unknown. We've felt the cool dawn air of the savannah and the warm glow of the first campfires. And now the stars are coming out. Imagine that for a moment. Not the metaphor, the actual stars. The same stars that your ancestors saw. The same constellations wheeling overhead night after night for millions of years. The Southern Cross hanging low on the horizon. The Milky Way so bright in unpolluted African skies that it casts shadows on the ground. Your ancestors lay on their backs and looked up at those same lights. And maybe they wondered too. Maybe that capacity for wonder, that quiet, gentle curiosity about the universe, was one of the first gifts Africa built into the human mind. The night is getting quieter now. The fire is just embers. The sounds of the day have faded into the deep, velvet silence of an African night crickets. Distant water, the occasional rustle of wind through dry grass. And somewhere in that silence, a thought. Not urgent, not anxious, just present. You are here. You are the result of something extraordinary. And that's enough. What does it mean? Seriously, what does it mean that every human alive, all 8 billion of us, carries a mind that was forged by one continent over 7 million years? Here's what I keep coming back to. We started this story with a number. 8 billion humans. 7,000 languages. Staggeringly different cultures. Different foods, different dreams, different ways of understanding the world. And yet, underneath all of that, underneath the languages and the borders and the religions and the politics and every single thing that seems to divide us, there's this. One continent, one story, One extraordinary, patient, relentless process that built every human mind that has ever existed. The diversity we see, the 7,000 languages, the infinite variety of human culture and belief and expression, is just surface variation on a single African theme. We are, all of us, variations on a melody that Africa composed over 7 million years. Think about that. The person next to you, if there is someone next to you, they carry the same story, the same African heritage, the same cognitive toolkit, built by the same climate and the same geography and the same predators and the same extraordinary pressures. And if you're alone right now, lying in the dark, listening to this, know that someone on the other side of the planet is doing exactly the same thing. Different language, different time zone, different life. Same African mind. Kind of beautiful, actually. The brain that's keeping you company right now, it followed this story for 2 hours. It imagined Raymond Dart holding a small skull in 1924. It stood at the edge of Africa, watching your ancestors cross into the unknown. It felt the warmth of a campfire 1 million years ago. That brain was built in Africa. Every neuron, every connection, every flash of understanding, every moment of doubt, every surge of love or grief or quiet wonder, all of it running on hardware that a continent spent 7 million years engineering. The climate trained you to adapt to change. The geography taught you to find creative solutions when there's no escape route. The predators gave you theory of mind, the ability to understand what another being is thinking. The same ability that lets you feel empathy, read a room, fall in love. And the lakes, those quiet Rift Valley lakes, fed the brain that would eventually write symphonies, build cathedrals, put footprints on the moon, and lie here in the dark, thinking about where it all began. You didn't earn this. Neither did I. It was given to us slowly, patiently, across a span of time so vast it makes everything else look like a footnote. Africa's gift to every human who has ever lived or ever will. And here's something else to sit with, if you want to. If it helps, the people you've loved, the ones who are still here, and the ones who aren't, they carried the same story in their DNA, the same African heritage, the same 7 million years of patient training running through their veins. Every conversation you ever had with someone you loved was 2 African minds, connecting minds built by the same continent, shaped by the same pressures, carrying the same ancient capacity for warmth and understanding and connection. That doesn't change. That doesn't go away. The people you've lost, they were part of this same extraordinary lineage, and in some deep, quiet way, so is every memory you carry of them. 7 million years of Africa's patient, relentless shaping lives on, in you, right now. And that person lying next to you tonight, or the stranger on the other side of the world who's listening to this same story right now, drifting off in a different time zone, in a different language of thought, with a completely different life story, same African family. Melbourne at dawn, Mexico City at midnight, Manchester at 3 a.m, same story, same continent, same 7 million year inheritance. We forget that sometimes. Life gets busy, the world gets loud, but underneath all of it always, quietly, permanently, we are one family, and Africa is home. The campfire has gone out now. Just a faint glow in the ashes, orange fading to grey, warmth fading to the cool of night. The stars are fully out, more stars than you've ever seen. A sky so dense with light it looks like someone scattered diamonds across black velvet. The Milky Way stretches from horizon to horizon, a pale river of ancient light. Somewhere, far off, a hyena calls, then silence. Deep African silence, the kind that has a texture to it. A weight, not empty, full of 7 million years of life and adaptation and wonder and slow, patient becoming. The grass rustles, the air cools another degree, your breathing slows. You're lying under the same sky your ancestors knew, the same stars, the same silence, the same gentle pull of sleep, that ancient universal rhythm that every human has surrendered to, every night, for as long as there have been humans. And maybe that's the most extraordinary thing of all. Not the fossils or the genetics or the climate data or the 2023 breakthroughs, but this quiet moment, this gentle drifting, this ancient African ability to lie still in the darkness and simply rest. Africa built that too, so rest. You've earned it, not tonight, not this week, but across a lineage so long it makes the pyramids look modern. Your ancestors survived everything Africa could throw at them for millions of years, so that you could lie here in safety, in comfort, and drift off to sleep. Let the story go. You don't need to remember any of it. It's already in you, written into every cell, every neuron, every quiet breath. The African night settles, the stars turn slowly overhead, the silence deepens, and somewhere in Melbourne, in Mexico City, in Manchester, in wherever you are right now, someone is falling asleep to the same story, the same ancient story, carried by the same ancient mind. Rest well. Good night.